here. Tonight's going to be more than an introduction to the concept of observational research, but also how to go about it and how to do some planning for it. Specifically, my objectives are fourfold tonight. To understand the basics of observational research as an approach to us to obtaining data for our PhD, to understand the different approaches to observational research and what that means in a practical sense, to investigate how to go about taking field notes and issues associated with recording, and finally to explore common ethical issues associated with undertaking observational research. Now, I'm going to start off with a true story that happened to a friend of mine who was a lecturer at Auckland University in the late 90s. And we were colleagues way back then. And he told me this fun story. And it happened to be true. He was entertaining a academic who I believe had come from Japan. And the academic was in Auckland for a few days to be able to give a few guest lectures and sort of just meet and greet, basically, not a particularly long placement. And my friend Steve had the task of hosting him for the international business department at the time. And Steve thought it would be a great idea to take the guy for an afternoon drink. And after walking a little bit around town, down one of the secondary, side streets, they found a bar, and the bar looked relatively empty. In fact, there was just staff in there, but it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so he wasn't exactly expecting a lot of people. They went in and they took a seat at the bar and they waited. And after about 5-6 minutes of them sitting there, nobody had served them. The staff was walking up and down, cleaning things, doing stuff. And my friend Steve sort of like, excuse me, can we please order a drink? Of which the wait staff were happy to oblige. Both gentlemen had their drink, talk, finished their drink, and staff still buzzing around doing stuff. And about 5 minutes later, their glasses had been empty on the bar for some time. He's like, I want another drink, but the staff don't seem to be serving me. So he, again, excuse me, could we have a drink? The service is a bit slow here. And that's actually what he said. And the wait staff turned to him and said, sir, we're actually closed, but we were doing the courtesy of giving you a drink while we were cleaning because we'll open in an hour or so. And obviously Steve and his guest were a little bit floored by that. But the reason why I wanted to tell that particular story is it's very much about perception. And it's very much about what we see versus what others see within a situation, which applies directly to observational research. If nobody tells you, or in this case, nobody told Steve that the bar was shut, yet he came in, he has an expectation. The bar staff, thinking they're doing a favor, also think that he was aware of the fact that they weren't actually open, but they were doing a courtesy to him. Now, in terms of observational research, there are always going to be multiple realities. And that's the challenge that we have to look at, because the way we interpret a situation or a scenario may actually be very different to the reality of that particular situation or scenario. So part of observational research is looking at ways that we can minimize the discrepancy between what we view as a researcher and what is really happening on the scene or the situation that we are engaged with. So let me ask a quick question. What is going on here? We look like we've got an angry woman, but at the end of the day, we don't actually know this. We know that we're in an airport or some form of transportation hub. We know that there's a crowd of people. A few of the people, the Chinese lady, for example, with the very white hair, or the Chinese looking lady with the white hair, looks very grumpy, but she doesn't look upset. The white lady in front in the black with the open mouth looks like she's either screaming or yawning, but to be fair, we can't make a distinction between that. And we're looking at the situation, thinking what we want to think about it. In actual fact, it could be just a normal, everyday, pre-pandemic, everyday queue at an airport waiting to get luggage. They've got trolleys they're hoping to get from the conveyor belt. Or it could be something more engaging and certainly more troublesome for those involved. Ultimately, what we've still got to come down to looking at is we have preconceived notions of what is happening, and because of that, our instant reactions are going to potentially be different. That also translates into research. When we're in the field observing behavior of individuals, we still put our own preconceived notions into the situation and what is happening. Now, this is static, and we're going to be talking about dynamic, but it's an important point for us to think about. So let's start with what is observation. It is a method of data collection where we research, or researchers observe within a specific field. So we're watching the actions or the behaviors of others. It's sometimes considered as an unobtrusive method, but reality is we may get involved, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. It can be external to or included within the group being observed. So as a researcher, we can either be part of the dynamic or we can be separate from the dynamic. So we're either inside looking in or we're outside looking in. And it's normally associated with ethnographic methodologies, but it's also part of other designs as well. Ultimately, what observation seeks to discover is what is going on here. We want to understand what is happening given a set of circumstances or a subset of the population. So where does our observation fit in on the research journey itself? It fits into the development of our research questions. In fact, sometimes the research questions themselves are derived from observation of other parties, or sometimes we simply just need to include our approach as an observation into the research, because the way that we are going to address these questions is actually through research. It has also a paradigmatic approach. So there's 4 terminologies here, and let me just briefly run through them. Ontology is effectively a branch of philosophy. It's the science of the kinds and structures of objects. In simple terms, it seeks to classify and to explain entities or things. So it concerns claims about the nature of being and the nature of existence. Now, this is going to apply for some of us in terms of the fact of how we go about using observation and how that helps us to further make the explanations. If we look at epistemology, it's the philosophy of knowledge. So epistemologists are philosophers who are interested in questions like whether it's possible to have knowledge, what kind of knowledge there is, and how people come to know things. So we might be looking at how we are developing an understanding of what we are observing through the interaction that is happening. Theoretical perspective is the assumptions or set of assumptions about reality that inform questions and, you know, inform the questions we ask, but also the kind of answers we arrive at as a result. In this sense, you know, a theoretical perspective can be understood as the lens through which we look, serving to focus or distort. So we might be a Marxist-based researcher, which is going to give us particular assumptions about how we interpret what we are actually observing. So we might choose to view it through the theoretical perspective to make sure that, you know, it's in alignment with our, I guess, thinking methods. The final one is methodology. You know, research methodology is specific procedures or techniques used to identify, select, process, and analyze information about any topic or any research. So the methodology allows the reader to critically evaluate the study's overall validity and reliability. And issues of validity and reliability actually are something that are very important for us to consider in observational research, because depending on the type of observational research, validity, etc., does actually change. We also fit observation into our information about the sample and the participants, not only how we obtain them, but how we describe them as well, and we'll talk about that. The methods we use of data collection, the methods we use of data analysis, and finally, the limitations and future opportunities from our research, because observational research, although helpful, can provide a certain set of limitations for us to investigate, and also for us to do further research from later on. So when should I go about conducting observational research? So under what circumstances does observational research give value to me on my research journey? And it's really looking at three broad areas. We want to see how participants behave in their natural setting. So this works well with psychology, it works well with education, it also works well with marketing and management subjects, because we can understand or we can observe the types of behaviors, the types of decisions that are made, the types of outcomes that are resultant from people going about their everyday business. It also helps us to look at creating new solutions or new options within that same parameters. It's also useful if we want to see how real world factors influence behavior. So, you know, me as an economist, we're so used to limiting all the factors that influence us so that we can understand what goes on, that we have to take the flip side and look at everything that can possibly influence what's happening. Many research designs, you know, whether they be qualitative or quantitative, try to be predictive. If we interview people, we might talk about actual behavior, of which they may or may not be particularly honest. We may talk about predictable or predicted behavior. And the challenge with that is, if you were given A, what would you do? B, C, or D? Is nobody really knows that that's actually how they're going to be when the situation happens. So if we already have predictive behavior and then we observe what happens in reality, we have an opportunity to compare just how impactful the real world really is. And what does that mean for our research outcomes and our approach to helping others with it. And thirdly, you know, it is useful for describing a phenomenon. So it's an opportunity to describe something that happens that we might not get in a controlled setting, or we might not get without a certain set of social or community parameters being around there as well. The value that comes from observation for the researcher. We're effectively better equipped to understand and to capture the context of actions. So for us, we're able to see the entire sphere of influence in a way that impacts on the decisions of the individuals being observed or the community being observed. It gives us firsthand experience in the setting, which allows us as researchers to be open to discovery and more inductive. It actually enables us to grow our understanding through experience rather than our understanding through prior research and literature. So it does help us to develop and to change perhaps our own interpretation and our own thinking about some of the issues. Research may also note phenomenon that has routinely escaped the awareness of the participant if we use a different method. So if, for example, we did a decent quality focus group, which can result in some fantastic information, but because of the presence of something or someone in a real world situation, all of the behaviors change or are different. Now, this can be a really good scenario in education. We look at doing a focus group, understanding how certain things work in the classroom, how children react, how teachers react. But then we look at the classroom and we note that there's a bully in the classroom and behaviors change a little bit because of the positioning of the bully within that particular environment. So, the bully is not something that we might have factored into our discussion when we go about with a focus group, but it's something that through observation, we can pick up on and notice that there is, of course, very, different or divergent sets of results there. And finally, it gives a chance to learn, to explore things that people may be unwilling to discuss during an interview or a focus group. And because it's part of their natural setting, something that they take for granted, they may never have thought to actually bring it up or to talk about it. But because we see it in reality through the observation, which may include interaction as well, but we see it through the observation of their behaviors, that, it gives us that chance to go that little bit further. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to observational research. The advantage is that observation really happens in a natural setting. It's not constructed, it's not hypothetical. So you're getting gut instinct response or gut instinct behavior, or closer to gut instinct behavior, natural behavior. When you're in a constructed or a hypothetical setting, people know they're being researched and often adjust their behavior according to what they think you want. Or, if we're looking at hypothetical, we're just really grasping at straws, because even though we can think we would do it this way, we know that chances are we would do it a very different way, or we don't even know what our reaction is going to be. A second advantage is it gives us deeper insights, because we're not only studying or we're not only researching what's happening, but we're getting that really broad landscape in which things are happening. We're getting those broader parameters that help us to look at the nuances a little bit differently, which means as we're interpreting, as we're analyzing a lot of data, we've got the opportunity to go deeper into our discussions. Now, that's going to give us some limitations as well, because it's not going to apply to a whole population. And the challenges of applying that are certainly different, but it may help us to look at certain nuances in more detail that could be generalized and then explored through other methodologies as well. Also, behavior is more natural and accurate, or I call honest, compared to a controlled or a post-event setting. So we're hoping to get the real person responding, not the observed or knowingly observed person responding. The disadvantages, though, it is difficult to control external variables as we have limited or no control over the environment. So that means we may actually end up with too much information, but we can't make a clear, we'll say, diagnosis. We can't make a clear set of outcomes necessarily from it. It is also quite time intensive because you spend a lot of time in the field, and it is potentially expensive compared to other research. Now that's expensive in terms of your time, in terms of recording and noting, in terms of how we're going to go about analyzing the data as well. So the aims of observational research really sixfold. First, seeing through the eyes of others, but also seeing through the experience. So we're viewing events, actions, norms, values from the perspective of the people being studied. It gives us that closer connection. When we look at description, attending to the mundane detail to help us understand what's going on, providing clues to other layers of reality from the from the research and from the activities that's happening. Number 3, contextualization. Whatever the sphere in which the data is being collected, we can only understand events when they're situated in both the wider social and the wider historical context. And observation helps us with that. In terms of number 4, process, we're viewing social life as a series of interlocking events rather than independent events, which we are more likely to find through other types of research, say, for example, focus groups or interviews, because they are post-event occurrence versus in situ happening as they occur. Number 5, being flexible research. A preference for semi or unstructured research design rather than imposing prior frames of reference onto the study. Now that helps us to be able to think through whether we have perhaps framed our research question or questions correctly, as well as whether or not the intended theoretical frameworks we have got or any other aspect of the research is actually 100% spot on for what we're doing. And that leads into number 6, avoiding the early use of theories and concepts. So it rejects our premature attempts to impose theories and concepts, which may fit poorly in terms of our participants' perspectives. So it has value there. Let's move on to controlled observation. So this is the first of the 3 types of observation that we're going to do. And this is not perhaps the one that I want to talk about the most, but it's still important to talk about. Now, we're often called this structured observation, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with or have watched the TV program Modern Family. There's an episode in, I think, season 7 or season 8 called Do Not Push. And the daughter, one of the key characters, is going to university, and the whole family go for a university open day. And they are offered some money to be part of a psychological experiment. And they go to the waiting room or the office or whatever, and they sit there. And the room is, I think, a little bit cold or something like this. And the switch for the aircon has this big sign, "Do not push." And they spend their whole time debating, oh, is this the experiment? What if I push it? Does that mean I'm a bad person? If I don't push it, blah, blah, blah. And they have all of this thing because they think that the experiment that they've signed up for to get their cash is an ethical decision on whether or not they push that little button. In the end, they push the button, and it turns out the unit stopped. The guy comes in. It's like, this isn't, why did you do that? We now have to call the repairman. And it later turns out that actually they were just in a waiting room, ready to go somewhere else for the situation. Now, why I chose to use that example is it's kind of like a controlled situation. You put people in an environment where you've controlled those parameters, and then you've kind of forced their hand at a set of potential actions. In this case, push or do not push. Now that is, somewhere where we are guiding the options rather than letting it happen naturally. If we take the sign away, for example, the observations are going to be different. The conversations that they will have are going to be different because there's not an element of doing something wrong in there, for example. Now, controlled observation is more typically a lab setting. It's more towards psychological studies, but there are opportunities to use it elsewhere as well. What's great about it is from an analysis perspective, it makes coding behavior extremely easy. The problem, though, we have is participants are more aware of the research, even if they're not necessarily fully aware of the intended purpose of it, but they are aware that research is happening, and as such, they may behave differently. Now, this is termed the Hawthorne effect, and what it looks at is, will we adjust our behavior because we know we are being watched? Quantitative outcomes are certainly a lot more possible because of measurement, coding, and outcome limitations. So, in this case, we have a sign, push or don't push. So there are two outcomes. What happened? Another measurable outcome. How long did it take them to make that decision from entering the room until pushing the button or not pushing the button? So it becomes very easy to get quantitative data that we can then measure and make inferences about. Non-participant research, though, it's viewed as non-participant research. The researcher in this case usually avoids contact. They keep distance. So you're watching through a two-way mirror, you're using video, but you're not necessarily engaging with the community that you are researching or the specific sample that you are researching. So that, that gives a very sterile approach. The advantage, though, is it is easy to replicate from other researchers. It's easy to test for reliability. Knowing what the steps are, knowing what the setup is, knowing what the parameters are, future researchers can do exactly the same research to see whether the same results come out or whether there's a difference, or to be able to compare between your sample and subsequent samples. The data becomes easier and quicker to analyze because it's quantitative. You're simply plugging or extracting, converting into numbers so that you can make analysis rather than trying to put emotions, opinions, perspectives, and other layers of analysis into it. And because it's usually relatively quick to conduct, it's repeatable. and you've got it set up to be repeatable, you actually have the potential to have a larger sample size with this. Okay, naturalistic observation. And this is where we start to study the spontaneous behavior of participants in their natural settings. Now, the researcher simply records what they see in whatever way they can. And we'll talk shortly about field notes, but this is perhaps one of the bigger challenges for us as researchers, is making sure that we can record and get the details. Now, we end up by recording our observations, usually without a system. That doesn't mean you don't have a system, but because we're not only looking for X, Y, and Z behaviors, we're also commenting on anything else that happens, or potentially, trying to find a linkage between other things that we see. It really is effectively quite loose in terms of how we record what we've got. That makes coding of behavior somewhat more challenging, but not impossible. It's kind of akin to observing animals in the zoo or the same animals in the wild. Animals in the zoo become your controlled observation because they've got the parameters of their cage. They've got the parameters of other animals that they're linked to. But in the wild, there are no boundaries. The landscape is open. The interaction that may occur with other animals is certainly there. Now, the strengths of naturalistic observation, we can observe the flow of behavior in the natural habitat, which has greater ecological validity. Hey, it's realistic. It's ideal for us for idea generation because it gives us as researchers an opportunity to study a total situation. And this often opens up new lines of inquiry that we haven't previously considered. But the weaknesses might make it ineffective or insufficient for our needs. We have a micro scale of observation, so we don't necessarily get a representative sample. It's harder for us to be able to generalize what we observe and what we take from that observation to a broader or larger population. And that might need different approaches to be able to get, conclusions that have a deeper meaning or a broader meaning from that. Natural observations are also considered less reliable as we cannot control some of the other variables that come into play. It's certainly very difficult for others to repeat the study. They can undertake a similar set of observations, but the parameters are not necessarily going to even be closely resembling the experience that you have during your situation. The researcher certainly needs very specific training to recognize specific aspects of behavior. For example, body language. This is not us going into a focus group where we're looking at words, we're looking perhaps at facial expressions, but we're within a group where we have a lot of control. We need to get additional training to help us understand, how do I look beyond what I expect to find? How do I know, or how do I instinctively or intuitively interpret or guess or even recognize if something external is influencing what is happening? How do I know that as I watch an event unfold in front of me, how do I know that certain things that are within that scene are things that I should be taking notes of? So that becomes something that we have to work on as researchers. If we're using observation, we need to make sure that our training or the training of our research assistants is certainly stronger, so that we can take advantage of the very rich information that's always in front of us that we don't really see, you know, seeing the forest for the trees type thing. It's there, we take it for granted. We don't necessarily recognize we have to make note of it. And because we cannot manipulate variables, because it's a, you know, it's a broader perspective, often it's very difficult for us to establish genuine cause-effect relationships. So that may have some impact on our choice as well. The final of the three types of observation is participant observation. And this has a, I guess we'll call it a close personal connection to what happens. It is a variant of naturalistic observation, but it's where you as the researcher embed yourself into the community of studies. So a couple of the most common historical studies of this type have been Humphreys, also Festinger. Humphreys actually broke the law in order to conduct his groundbreaking research, which ultimately helped change the law as well. But he was initially an external observer who grew, I guess in a way, grew to become an internal participant in the community being researched as well. Now, as a result, we get the opportunity to either be covert or overt in what we do. So we can be very undercover in the sense that either we are there, but they, the people being observed, believe we are something different to what our real role is, or we can be quite honest about it and, you know, open and upfront, and they still continue knowing that we're part of the research process. Now, this gives us, you know, a couple of ethical concerns, and we'll come back to ethics, you know, in a few moments' time. But it does involve deception versus informed consent. And if we're being covert about our research, you know, we're there, we're pretending to be something or someone that we are not, we are technically deceiving our participants. And we have got to be able to justify from an ethics perspective, is it worth it? Are we potentially causing harm and so forth? But it's also, how do we go about obtaining informed consent? Are we hoping that we can conduct our research without ever having to get informed consent because we're not going to identify individuals, or we're not going to be able to identify communities, in which case there should not be an issue? Or are we getting such rich data that we actually have an obligation for informed consent, but consent comes post-observation, in which case it's not informed? Or it is in a way, but it's certainly only done afterwards. So the respondent or the participant's perspective on things may be a little bit, we'll just say, less comfortable with that. The limitations that we have with this is it can be difficult to get time. It can certainly be difficult to get privacy for recording. You know, if you're doing covert research, you can't openly note take without drawing attention to yourself. You can't stand there with your phone and video what you see in front of you. So, you know, what we end up by doing is relying upon our memory a lot more. The limitation here is we remember certain things, but they may not have been what we would have necessarily written down. We're also unlikely to remember direct quotations of things that were said or exact sequences of how something occurred, which means that the data isn't quite as rich for us. The other challenge and limitation is that a researcher can become too involved with the community that they're researching. You know, they may lose objectivity, they may become biased. I put here, in a way, it's similar to Stockholm Syndrome. You know, you become part of a situation and you change the objectivity that you have of you in relation to that situation. And that can actually impact on the quality of research. It may also mean that selective reporting may also appear. We may choose to ignore a couple of things because we decided, you know what, I like that person a bit too much. I don't want to put their thoughts into my research, even though that they're valid, but because of your personal relationships and personal understandings of the individuals, it may change. So this ultimately reduces data validity for us. The steps in observational research are quite simple. We determine our research objective, we determine the questions and create the research guide that we want to use. We establish our method of gathering data, so how we're going to go about this. And one of the questions we have to make here, or one of the ideas that we have to think about is, are we going to record this electronically? Do we set up cameras that are hidden? Do we set up microphones that are hidden so that we get additional data? Am I going to rely on field notes versus technology to help me? And I think, you know, we've moved sufficiently into a technology age where we can put a camera in our button and nobody will ever see it. But that's something about gathering data that we have to consider and address. We then go about, we observe, we prepare our data, and then we analyze the behavior within it. Now, the preparing the data and the analyzing the behavior is definitely the harder thing, but it's not really what we want to talk about too much today, sorry. Let's move into field notes. So these are the sorts of things that we are looking for, whether we're recording with technology or recording old school. What we're looking to do is get information, get ideas, get, I don't want to call them facts, observations of what's happened. So we ask, you know, we're looking at what are people doing? What are they trying to accomplish in the scenario? How exactly do they go about doing this? And this is, I guess, on the individualistic level as well, because 2 people or 20 people may approach the same scenario, the same task, completely different way. How do people characterize and understand what's going on? What are their reactions to the situation that they find themselves in? And how do they structure it? Not only how do we interpret what they're doing, but how do they structure it for themselves? What assumptions do they make? And, you know, one of the assumptions that may be made is nobody's watching us. So, of course, they behave in a way that might be less legal or less ethical than if somebody was, for example, you know, if they were knowing that somebody was observing. From an analytics perspective, you know, what do I as the researcher see going on here? So it's not only what's happening, but what do I see? You know, what's different for me? What did I learn from the observation myself? You know, what assumptions did I make? What assumptions have changed for me, or what awareness of a situation has changed for me? Why did I include those into my field notes and my interpretation? You know, because did it change my perspective as a researcher? Did it change my perspective as a person? We should also be asking what else is happening in this site that is relevant to my research question or questions. So it's not only looking at a particular preset of things that we're hoping to understand, but what other factors have an involvement, whether causal or not, but what other factors have an involvement in what's happening? And how do I then, do I want to be able to include some form of discussion about those, or do I need to go back and perhaps rethink inclusion of certain things into my literature review, for example, because these things I hadn't thought about before. And finally, how do I feel collecting this data? The role of you as a researcher, the emotions involved, is also quite important because that changes how you objectively treat the observation and the data and ultimately the analysis. So are you comfortable with this? Do you feel like an imposter because you've lied to somebody? And is that going to affect the data in any particular way? Now, recording of data is the next thing that I want to look at. And it really is an important decision that we want to be able to make, is how do I go about recording the data that I've got? Now, we'll start off by, how do I classify and record it? And we have three different methods. Event sampling is when the observer, or you as the researcher, decides in advance what type of behavior or events, activities you're interested in, and you record all of those occurrences. But that means you ignore everything else. So you're only looking for specific actions. So, that gives us some limits, but it also makes sure that we are picking up on certain actions, certain behaviors, or certain situations that may happen. The second one is time sampling. So this is where you as a researcher determine in advance that your observation is only going to take place during specified time periods. So for example, you might do 10 minutes of observation every hour for X amount of days, or you might do 1 hour of observation once a day for a particular time period. So during those specific time periods, you record the occurrence of the specified behavior, but you're looking at broadly, you're looking at everything, or you might combine the two. You may do event and time sampling together. So, every 30 minutes on the half hour, you're watching for behavior X, Y, and Z. And you do that for a period of 4 weeks. Kind of like sitting there with a camera and just going click, 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 and getting that time series data in a way. The third one is instantaneous or target time sampling. So as the researcher, you decide in advance the pre-selected moments, and then you take and record everything that is happening at that instant. Everything that happens before or after is ignored. So you're not getting, you might not be getting, say, every day at 12 o'clock. You may be getting different pre-selected moments. Monday may be 12, Tuesday may be 3, Thursday may be 10:30 in the morning, but you're looking at what's happening. You're not looking at what's going in and out beforehand. That works for that as well. Now, the final point, I guess, to look at is that associated with ethics. And, we're looking here, both participant or research-oriented ethics issues, but we're also looking a little bit at institutional ethics challenges as well. From the participant or research-oriented stage, we look at informed consent. Do we have it? Do we need it? How do we get it? You know, our ethics application to our internal review board or to our ethics committee may say, look, there's no chance whatsoever of identifying any of the individuals. Their images are not going to be used, their names are not going to be used, nothing that would specifically identify, you know, even a type of language or approach to how they speak that's unique, that would identify back to them. So you may ask for an informed consent waiver, that it's not actually required, all part of the ethics process. You've got to think about the voluntary participation. You know, when you're observing someone and they don't know that you're observing them, you are breaching their typical right to voluntary participation. Do we obtain, if we do need to have involvement here, is this pre-event? Do we ask after we've done our research and say, look, I've been stalking you for the last 3 months, recording you, this is my project, can you sign off on it? Or is it non-existent? Now, in most cases, if we can't identify or find way, or, you know, if our research cannot identify specific individuals or I'll say marginalized communities that might be at risk, then it's going to be considered non-existent. We have to look at whether or not we are being coercive in our research. So if we become covert and we go in and we pretend to be something that we are not, or someone that we are not, and we're getting information, we're getting responses from our individuals, then we are being coercive in what we do. We are leading them on. Now, again, an ethics application is not to tick the box about yes or no, I'm doing this. It's to justify whether the results outweigh any potential harm that could be caused to the community being researched. So it doesn't mean being coercive is wrong. It doesn't mean that coercive behavior cannot happen, because it can. It just means we need permission for it. We want right to privacy, which comes to, I guess, a point, if we're recording people, we need to make sure that imagery or voice sound bites are not going to go beyond us as researchers. If we're including somebody's image into our research, then of course we need informed consent at some stage. So we've got to look at, you know, balancing these types of things. We've got to address these as part of our ethics discussion. We've also got to address them as part of our ethics application. And finally, recording, you know, it also involves storage. Where are we putting, where are we storing all of this? Who is going to have access to it? How can it be used beyond this research? So for example, if I do some recordings, am I going to be using this with perhaps a journal article or two as well? From an institutional perspective, we're looking at issues of value and risks, or risk to the reputation of the institute itself. So if you're doing some research that might be considered a little bit unethical, could that potentially damage the institution or the standing of the institution? Is there going to be a value for the institution as well that comes out of the research? So for example, are you, as a contributor to the institution, then going to be able to work with others to create solutions for the groups that you are mentioning? Now, I just want to read you something that I think is important to talk about with ethics. So please give me a moment as I read this. But in completing the ethics protocol, as a researcher, you need to consider the following. So in addition to what I've just talked about, methodology. So researchers should fully explain the settings, what potential interactions are involved, how data will be gathered, the kinds of issues that might be discussed more formally, and detail as much as possible of the anticipated process. It's fine to acknowledge the limitations of predicting ahead of time what will happen during the research, but details that can be anticipated should be stated. Now, this is for your ethics application. When we look at participants, describe the people and reflect the potential ethics issues that may arise in the context of your research. It is acceptable to disregard issues of sample size, inclusion and exclusion criterion, unless these are specifically relevant to your methods. The researcher also needs to explain how he or she plans to enter the field and make people more familiar with his or her presence and the nature of the project. From potential harms, the researcher should expand as much as possible on the extent and the variety of potential harm to participants, recognizing that these will primarily involve social, legal, or psychological harms, depending on the nature of the research and the vulnerability of the group. The repercussions of breaching confidentiality may be greatly tied to the risk of harm. Now, this, as I said, is not going to apply for everybody, but there are going to be situations where you are going to want to make sure that you have given extremely detailed consideration to this. From privacy and confidentiality, the researcher should provide information about how he or she will safeguard data once collected and treat sensitive information. This should be in line with data security requirements outlined in your university policies and guidelines. If there's a foreseeable risk that information may be requested by third parties, the researcher should discuss how he or she would respond to such a request. Now, the potential harm is exposing an individual during an illegal activity, for example. In this case, the request by a third party may be police, may be government. If we're looking at education, it may be parents, it may be schools, many possibilities here. So it's not only about recognizing it could be happening, it's recognizing and outlining for yourself what steps or what policies or what procedures are you putting in place to address such requests. And the final one, I'm just going to touch on informed consent again, because it's part of what I wanted to share. The researcher should elaborate on the appropriateness of a particular informed consent process, be it written or verbal, for the setting or the group studied, and should include means of informing the community, the group, the individuals of your identity as a researcher, the purpose, the topic of research, the method, and the appropriateness of seeking consent from group leaders or spokespeople, perhaps. Informal or formal means of obtaining informed consent relative to what is appropriate in the given setting. Remember, all of these issues with ethics fit on a continuum. There's no yes or no answer. But it is important to clearly explain the ethical dilemmas that might arise or the limitations to ideal procedures in given contexts. Now, I'm going to hand over for